going to go ahead and start with my introductions. As more people come, we will admit them into the room. It's great to see everybody, especially in such bad weather. I hope everyone is safe and comfortable as we just are going to kind of ride out this rain tonight. Good evening and welcome, friends who are live streaming this program on the Edith Garland Dupree Library's YouTube page and the Acadiana Community Channel page. I am Shaylin Woods, and I'm the archivist and head of the Ernest J. Gaines Center and the Edith Garland Dupree Library. I welcome you to this week's book discussion hosted by the Edith Garland Dupree Library. Dupree Library has become an active and vibrant part of the community. We play a large role in disseminating the history and culture of our area, including topics that are current and critical for our community. Our library is rich in resources that support the research needs of our users, book discussions, such as the one we're hosting tonight, and for the next several weeks, are one more way we fully support the instructional and research programs of the University of Louisiana Lafayette and provide access to information to the community. This Who Gets to Vote reading and book discussion series is funded by a grant from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities through the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. This series was developed by LEH and is intended to engage members of the public in conversations on the history of voting in the United States. And we are so happy to be working with two of our UL faculty members and scholars who are leading the book discussions. Tonight's discussion will be led by Dr. Theodore Foster. Theodore Foster has earned a PhD in Black Studies from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. And since the fall of 2019, he has been a member of the History Department as an assistant professor of African American history here at the University of Louisiana Lafayette. He researches the political and historical memory within civil rights, Black freedom, and racial progress narratives. Thank you so much for leading our discussion today, Dr. Foster.
Awesome. You hand the mic over to me now?
Yes, it's all you, sir.
Cool. Well, thank you, Shay, for that introduction. And thank you to all the librarians at the Dupree Library at the University of Louisiana Lafayette for really putting in a lot of work last minute to apply for this grant. And I would encourage everyone on the call today to check out the website, which I guess we could throw in the chat if someone has access, or you probably already have access to it if you're on the YouTube channel. But there's a nice library guide for Black women's history that our librarians put together. So please check that out if you like Vanguard or you find this conversation about Black women's history and voting rights really interesting. I think that guide will be really helpful. Also wanted to say thank you to LEH for putting together what is a really wonderful book discussion and kind of public literacy program about not only the history of voting rights, but Black history and women's history. We're in Women's History Month in March. We just wrapped up Black History Month. And I think this book really celebrates the spirit of these kind of national and international discussions about history and why it matters, and in particular in relation to questions of democracy, access to the ballot, that this book in particular, Martha Jones' Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, is meant to contribute to, right? This is the only book that specifically focuses on Black women's history. And I think that's significant for our discussion tonight, and that I want to be, some of the ground for our discussion. My pronouns are he, him, his. After I get done with some kind of opening remarks, I'll ask those on the call to introduce yourselves. I guess the 12 of us will be those discussing on this chat, but I do hope we can get, questions and comments from other folk, perhaps on the YouTube channel feed or otherwise. This is, again, an excellent opportunity for Lafayette Public. And I see some of our students are on the call too at UL. I think we should think about Black women and the work that they do in our approach to this discussion, not just as a way of including unsung heroes or hidden figures or forgotten voices, but really as a lens for thinking about the vote, democracy, and how the narrative of American exceptionalism, the narrative of progress, change over time, changes when we center Black women. Not simply because we're including folk, right? But again, as a method of reading history and the politics of Black women. I should say that I'm also teaching a class at UL, shameless plug, called Black Women's History, Generations, Inheritance, and Memory, which I think really encapsulate, in terms of those themes, some of the work that Martha Jones is doing in this text. We are reading this text in that book. We were already reading it prior to, or it was already on the syllabus prior to this Who Gets to Vote kind of release. So this is exciting to extend what we do in the classroom in many ways to the public. Toward that end, I thought it would be helpful for us to ground some of our discussion in some poetry. My Black Women's History class engages in a kind of interdisciplinary way Black women's literature, in particular poetry and short stories, to fill in gaps where the archive perhaps doesn't tell us a full narrative of Black women's experiences. Poets, writers have long sort of filled that gap. So another quick plug, myself and Professor Maria Stewart in the English department at the University of Louisiana Lafayette have put together a really excellent critical Black studies speaker series to fill some gaps in the university's engagement with this really important field, Black studies, for this moment. And next week on Friday at 4 p.m., we are inviting a poet from Alabama who's an educator at the Alabama School of Fine Arts. Her name is Ashley Jones, and she has a really powerful poem that I want to read briefly alongside perhaps a caller on the Zoom, and Tranquilla and Shay, if you'll, break up this reading of the poem. I'll share my screen and we can watch it. But Ashley Jones is coming out with her third book of poetry called Reparations Now in November. She started off with an excellent collection of poetry on historical memory in Birmingham in 2015. And then in 2017, released another collection of poetry called Dark Thing. So check out Ashley Jones. She's a really excellent up-and-coming Black woman poet. And we'll be hosting her at UL. So I'm gonna share my screen. We'll read this poem, and then I'll open it up with some questions to get the conversation going.
Do you have an order you want us to read in?
Yeah, what I'll do, the poem is sort of in three parts. I'll read the first part to My Grandmother's Raised, the bottom of the screen. Then I'll move the screen up to My Grandmother's Raised Generation. And then I'll invite Shay to read this section. And then I'll have Tranquilla conclude for this section, okay? It's a very visual poem as much as it is, kind of performance piece. I know she'll read this next week and share this with our class. It's also available online right now. It's titled, I Cannot Talk About the South Without Talking About Black Women, a golden shovel for Lucille Clifton. Reading poetry just, animates a lot of the text on the screen. So I want us to really think about the, Black women that Martha Jones introduces us to, and the lens for understanding Black women's history Ashley Jones communicates through this poem. My grandmothers made America, made the fibers that made us warm, made us invincible, heroines. To tell you who they are, I must start with who they are not. Servants, kitchen-bound mammies, silently obedient wives. We can't, in our modern comforts, imagine the survival they learned was theirs to claim can't hold the light that they burned through this colonial darkness. What tricks this nation, this American South, pulled minute by minute to keep my grandmothers convinced the body you're in is not enough. Your race and your gender work together to mark you less, to mark you takeable. But what they didn't know was that my grandmothers still had an immovable strength, enough to build a bridge from here to heaven. I know when I leave this broken earth, I'll find them there, sweetening every hour. And Shay, I'll let you continue.
My grandmothers raised a generation of American men. There is no other way to say this. Look at any Southern family and you'll find somewhere in a past most will not claim a Black woman. These men who call themselves bootstrapping and self-made, somewhere there's a Black woman and her unthanked hands who lifted them to where they are now. My father tells a story of the sons of his grandmother's employers, how they, instead of the pension she was promised, decided to give her a damned old tire, an old suitcase, dusty in the yard. What thanks is this for the years she raised that family, for the care they cannot forget. My father could never forgive these men, their Southern tradition, their American tradition. Even now, they tell us Black women we are going to save this whole nation with votes or magic or our style taken and renamed, but this is no longer the land of masses and mammies, and we are only superheroines for our own daughters and sons. My grandmothers did not give their lives for me to keep nursing this country, to keep shucking and jiving in a bizarro American dream. My grandmothers are worth more than corrupt remembering.
And Tranquilla, would you please grace us with your voice?
Now, there is no room for the Dixieland lie. We no longer hold these truths you made us accept. Under God, yes, we hear him singing a song of powerful love despite the united hate of America. Grandmothers, women made of salt and spirit, you are faith continuous. Continue us. Raise us to be heroes and heroines, to tell this country that we are not mules, not beasts. You, an army of workers and wives, we hid our fears and woes in your indestructible, ever-present ladiness. The blood you pass down to us is all we will ever need to save our lives.
Excellent. Again, the title of this poem is I Cannot Talk About the South Without Talking About Black Women. And I would add, I cannot talk about voting rights or the history of voting rights without talking about Black women, right? It's that foundational of a experience in politic and poetics, as we heard in Ashley Jones' poem, that informed the work of all of these women across the 9 chapters that make up this book. The title of this book, again, is Vanguard, which is one question I have for you all. What do you think she meant by Vanguard? She talked about this in the introduction a bit, but if Vanguard is meant to sort of signal those at the forefront of a movement or a way of thinking, how are these Black women the vanguard for women's rights, not just Black women's rights, right? There's a tension there in the text. Martha Jones has remarked that she wrote this book because last year there was a national celebration of the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. And she was concerned about a monument and commemoration that erased Black women as opposed to centering them in this question and tension over the right to vote and the history of Black voting rights, which extended to Black men in 1870 after the Civil War, but not to Black women. So she wrote this book in response to that absence to try and fill in a gap in a narrative. So again, the title of this program across 4 books for UL, but 6 books total, is Who Gets to Vote? To which I might ask, who are we? That I think this book deepens our understanding of who we are, who gets to vote, and how Black women, despite not having access to the ballot fully and formally until 1965, have wielded political power in a variety of different organizations that were Black-led, they were led by white women, to argue and insist, as Jones puts it, for equality for all. So I have a number of points in the text that I'll point to over the course of the evening, depending upon how conversation goes, but wanted to take some time for you all to introduce yourselves however you'd like. What I'd like to hear is what name you prefer to be referred to and your pronouns. Aside from that, again, welcome to this space. I really look forward to facilitating the conversation moving forward. We can just go around the Zoom, as it were. We would go around the room, but please, let us know your name and perhaps, definitely your pronoun, but also, what questions you bring to the space that for us to discuss, right? One question, because it'll be a lot as we go around the room, but one question that's on top of your mind that I can write down so we can return to.
Matthew, come on.
Okay, I guess I just got nominated to start. So I think everybody can see my little thing here. My name's Matthew Green. I'm a professor in the College of Education. Putting on the spot for like one question. I never just have one question. I think one of the questions that I have around this text, and Theodore, as you were talking about the title Vanguard, is sort of, I have immediately stuck in my head. I watched Judas and the Black Messiah a couple weeks ago, and so I have the Rainbow Coalition stuck in my head, and sort of what does that mean for collective action? And in this sense, right, like the vanguard of Black women, of carrying everybody with them. It's not really a question. I guess it's more of like a thought that becomes sort of a discussion. But yeah, pronouns he, him, his. I'm Matthew Green.
Thank you, Matthew.
I'm Tranquilla. I am a second year history grad student. I know a couple of people in here. My pronouns are she, her. And as I was talking to Dr. Foster earlier today, I was really interested in chapter 7, and we can talk about that later, just in the way we kind of have to talk about the federal government in all of this and their lack of care in the sense of always turning to states' rights. Sorry, my cat is acting crazy. But yeah, as history has shown us time and time again, using the states' rights argument is just a way for the federal government to not have to act on certain subjects, certain topics, certain issues. But I'm gonna stop now so we can have something to talk about later.
My name is Kaylyn Mckee. I am also in the College of Ed. My pronouns are her and she. My biggest, I guess, question or thought, I have a lot, but I remember learning in, American history about grandfather clauses and literacy tests and poll taxes, but I never, I guess, realized or understood the layering effect and how that really it was strategic to keep Black people away from voting. And I just don't understand why that's not more a part of our history in schools. I remember it being mentioned briefly in elementary history class. And then I guess because in college there's so many choices for history, but I feel like that is something that should be required. And so I guess my question is, how does the education system as a whole let that big of an issue fall through the cracks? I guess that wasn't really a question, but more of a statement.
I'll go. First to get it right. My name is Victoria, hers, and what's the most, how many teachers are profiled in the book? And kind of wonder about the role that education might have played, and that low privilege having education would have played in their role in the, Black rights movement.
You were breaking up just a little bit. Oh, Shay, you want to go ahead?
That's what I was going to say. Victoria, I was going to tell you, you're breaking up a little bit. If you want to try to restart your audio, if that's possible, because we really want to be able to hear you and for you to be able to fully participate with us tonight. If you can't, please feel free to type your questions and I will happily read them or direct Dr. Foster towards your questions. We absolutely want you to participate in any and every way possible.
So throw that question in the chat. It was a good question, but I couldn't hear all of it. So I want to, be able to add it to the list. Maybe I'll call on people. Vicky, do you mind introducing yourself ever so briefly to our conversation? I know you were on the last call last week as well. So welcome again.
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. Same plug in, plug out. Vicki Chrisman, she, her. I am a former reference librarian, nonprofit worker, and now work in government. And I was just interested in how all these pieces with this discussion and the local community debate all fit together. Mm-hmm. I have no specific question at this time.
Mr. Clark?
Sure. Jimmy Clark, he, him, his. I serve and function as a senior director of state policy for a firm called HCM Strategist that's out of Austin, Texas. I'm a Lafayette resident, formerly Dean of Students and Dean of Enrollment Management at UL Lafayette years ago. History major from UC Santa Barbara, way back. And I've just always been enthralled with politics, had the privilege of serving as the political, consultant on Channel 10 for 20-something years, preceding Dr. Cross. And so I thought it would be important for me to continue to kind of plug in, listen here, very interested in how history certainly impacts future. And I'm real curious to hear how you take it. Kind of the book, I thought, kind of left us at a key point, obviously, in voter rights that we're facing now. And I'm curious, in particular, as a result of this book, how African-American women are going to be perceived. Will they be in the vanguard? Is this the tipping point? Is the Stacey Abrams, circumstance an isolated instance, or is it a groundswell that we'll see? And I'm just curious how people will kind of contribute to that.
These are all really awesome questions. I'm so excited to that we'll get to engage with these questions.
I believe we have two other people on the call who I also encourage to participate, and Tiffany and Zach. Can the people see y'all? If so, chime in. This conversation is for everyone. Shay, obviously, you know, I don't have to tell you twice to chime in, but
I'll go, I guess. Hi, everybody. I'm Zach Stein. I'm one of the co-PIs of this grant. I'm also the head of special collections over at the library. Pronouns are he, him, his. I guess as far as a question, I mean, one thing that I find fascinating, and actually Jimmy just kind of pointed this out, was like this last election was just this incredible surge of voters, especially among Black voters. And now, obviously I'm hoping that this is not an isolated incident. I think it's incredible. However, what I'm finding unfortunate is that we're now seeing a pushback, because we're seeing these voter restriction bills being released or being released or whatever. And of course, they seem to be specifically targeting Black populations. I'd be very curious to see like where this would go, and will they fail, or will it set us back to where it was before? I'd be very interested to get that conversation going. And also just to add, I did put in some links to our site, the Who Gets to Vote page, the study guide for this book, and also a digital exhibit on the League of Women Voters that you guys can view whenever. So that's all in the chat.
Well, hello everyone. I am Tiffany, and pronouns are she and her. I am a librarian and one of the grant writers as well. And I guess one of my thoughts is really kind of what we talked about last week, and what Dr. Foster was saying is, you know, who is we? One, because there are different inequalities depending on who you are. So that's just kind of a question when people always say, well, we have these equalities or we are this. Who are we speaking of when we talk about we?
We have Ms. McKinley, who just joined. Please introduce yourself and let us know your pronouns and a question you have regarding the text. We can come back to that.
Yeah, let's come back to Ms. McKinley, who is also a student of mine and my History 380 Black Women's History class. I know she can't get her video to work, but I think her audio should be able to work to call in. So I'm sure she'll chime in when she can. So I like the kind of return that Tiffany just gave us to, who is the we and, who gets to vote. So I guess, in terms of the experiences of Black women, I'm sure there was loads of new kind of contexts and histories that you were introduced to. But I guess if we're thinking about, Black women and the work that they do, how do we understand the ways in which race and gender position Black women to embark upon a certain set of politics in relation to questions of slavery, Jim Crow, the right to vote, the Civil War? What new figures impacted your understanding of, the political culture of the early 19th century? This is a time, 40, 50 years before the Civil War. Formal slavery is in play. Black women are not, docile, simple servants, right? That's why I really like what Jones brought us in the poem, right? Let me tell you who we are not first, because there's such a dominant representation of Black women as, as happy kind of servants, this mammy stereotype that Jones talks about later in the text that I want to turn to. But, Jones begins by talking about woman in her lineage, right? And how it was her questions and thinking about, what was the life for Nancy Bell Graves in 1808, right? As a Black woman who's invested in a certain kind of political culture. This question of who we are, some people sort of discussed that last week, but I'm curious how you might answer that question or respond to it after reading this book and some of the questions and context you're presented with in terms of Black women's experiences and politics. Who are some figures that speak to that were, interesting for you in any moment in the text? You said what?
So I think what's really interesting, I think with me in the poem, what's the understanding the lineage and starting with who we are not and thinking about Kaylyn's question and thinking about Victoria's question, who unfortunately is also unable to hear us. So this idea of the lack of understanding of the role Black women have always played in American politics. We ebb and flow through this information all the time. All the time there is this heavy ebb and flow about who Black women are and what they've done for this country. But it's always been there. It's just very much so been hidden and kind of viewed in a weird granular kind of way, which makes it niche, essentially. People are really fascinated about it, dig into that, but it pops up in pop culture, it pops up in movies, even in comics and things like that. It's always there. But this understanding that Black activism amongst Black women, political activism for Black women is not new and is not something that popped up with Stacey Abrams. Going back to the 1800s, even especially on the East Coast, there were Black women who were fighting for suffrage rights. Back then, they got literally pushed to the back of the line in that fight, but their labor was the foundation of that movement. It just became too much of a risk to talk about that and also and not talk about the way Black people in general are being treated. So Black women have always had to take a back seat to American Blackness more than anything else, which puts Black women in general in a very dangerous situation and has always put Black women in a very dangerous situation.
Yeah, that's really powerful, Shay. I think, Martha Jones makes the point in one of her interviews that, and we see this repeated often, there's the movement for women's suffrage and the movement for Black suffrage, not the movement for Black women, right? It's as if they aren't present in these kind of, demands for inclusion, demands for rights, demand for liberation. But when we do center Black women, we have to think differently about that kind of framing. And Jones related that to the 2008 presidential election, and in terms of the Democratic primary in particular, in which much of the debate repeated the same kind of context in the early, 20th century and late 19th century. Hillary Clinton was, presented as the women's vote, right? This universal, every woman's woman kind of candidate. And Barack Obama was positioned, this is the dominant media kind of representation, as somebody who was vying to become the first Black president, right? But not thinking about the intersection of Black women, right? As having to then choose between this or that, right? That's part of the framing that I think erases Black women when we think of the history of voting rights that Shay was speaking to briefly. That I think gets to the who are we, if we're thinking about race and gender as dominant frames in American history, that literally absent Black women in our articulation then and now. So y'all can answer the who are we question or take it wherever you like.
I was going to sort of add on to what Shay was saying. I think one of the interesting elements of the identity piece and sort of the narrative of what gets drawn out are all the different institutions that Black women found themselves in pushing for progress, right? It wasn't just politics. It wasn't just voting, right? It was education, healthcare, like, and the way that aspect of the fight sort of tries to get flattened into just being one-dimensional. But it really was like that aspect of activism, and it was activism in all different layers and all different aspects of society, not just sort of the one that we typically think about.
No, that's really helpful. It's not a single issue kind of vote or situation. But Jimmy, you were going to hop in.
Yeah, I'm always curious about the concept of the history of the inarticulate in terms of identifying the I don't know, I'm using the term wrong, but the average citizen, the not the individual who ends up in leadership or influencing. It's the everyday person, and the women that were highlighted in the book obviously had contributions that they made to elevate themselves, certainly to the author. And I kept asking myself, what were those qualities? What were those opportunities? What were those things that allowed them differently? And back in the, I was really intrigued by, and I'm sure I'm not going to remember her entire name. It was Carrie was the last name. She was the publisher who emigrated to Canada and then came back at one point. And just to think about her journey and the fact that she left and lived an everyday life of sorts for a while in Canada, and then became a publisher, but had to do it under the auspices of not being the editor, as I recall the story that was presented, that the men had to be listed as the editors of the publishers of the circumstance, and then paralleling that with the same I guess arc of leadership, where not only in the publishing field, in the writing capacity, but tag team with the orators and the ability of these women to get up on podiums and speak articulately in a way, and I kept thinking to myself, how does the everyday person who has not been allowed the opportunities to read and write as others, how do they get to this point? How does that occur? What is it that drives? What is it that gets to that point? And I'm just, I don't have the entire answer in my head. And how is that then again reflected today? How are those individuals in schools and circumstances, without resources, without situations, how do they elevate? How do we have a speaker, as we did at the the Biden ceremony, who can elevate and transcend and just galvanize everyone with a voice and an oration and with words and with writing? It just is it's intriguing to me. I'm not sure if that leads to a question or a comment. It's just thoughts on my mind.
No, I think they're really powerful thoughts. And I hear you, one, asking a question about the kind of distinction between the exceptional narrative a lot of these Black women kind of occupy, certainly in the narration of Martha Jones, but also that there must be, and there is, I would argue, a kind of quotidian or everyday humdrum, mundane, seemingly mundane kind of experience that Black women have always been positioned like a pressure cooker forced into, that clearly have roots in slavery, that require a kind of turn to that moment. And you were talking about Mary Ann Shadd Cary, Cary, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, her case is phenomenal. There's so many contexts that are phenomenal about, Cary's context, the mobility that she had, the kind of voice that she had as a writer, right? And, as you identify, there are kind of exceptional writers within the context of Martha Jones' narrative, as well as exceptional orators. who are wielding these skills that I think are rooted in a kind of similar experience. In my Black Women's History class, we were reading a really important essay that I think gets to your question, Jimmy, by Angela Davis, written in 1972 when she was imprisoned in Marin County Jail. She was frustrated with the narrative about Black women during a moment of, social movement, Black liberation movement, Black power movement that often positioned Black women in really flattening ways, right? As well as that kind of feminist movement that also sort of adds to the Black women in really flattening ways, really having to do with these stereotypes about Black women, who Black women are not, right? So Angela Davis sat down in the jail with no primary sources to write about who Black women are not and who they actually are, right? And this essay is titled Reflection on the Black Women's Role in the Community of Slaves. She's writing about 72 as much as she's writing about the context of slavery that Black women find themselves in as, caregivers, as Ashley Jones was putting, right, for the Black family in terms of the conditions of survival were the kind of domestic sphere, the home. But that Black women were also positioned as domestic workers, right, in the homes of slave owners in which they're caring for, quite literally breastfeeding the children of, the white kind of slave owner and white woman, while also caring for her own children, while also being subject to racial sexual violence in that context, right? So Davis points to a certain survival-oriented practices that Black women, and I would argue, remain positioned in many ways. She writes, precisely through performing the drudgery, which has long been a central expression of the socially conditioned inferiority of women, the Black woman in chains could help to lay the foundation for some degree of autonomy, both for herself and for her men. Even as she was suffering under her unique oppression as female, she was thrust by the force of circumstances into the center of the slave community. She was therefore essential to the survival of the community. Not all people have survived enslavement. And that was a powerful kind of like short line, right, that they really need to sit with. Hence, her survival-oriented activities and or practices were themselves a form of resistance. Survival, moreover, was the prerequisite of all higher levels of struggle, right? And we often center Black men, we think about, voting rights, civil rights, Black liberation struggles, slave revolts, Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey. It's not, this Black woman held the house down. And without that, we're not doing anything, right? So I think, there is this relationship to survival of a community, despite your survival perpetuating this context, not assigning blame to Black women, but there was literally a profit motive placed upon Black women's reproductive capacities during slavery, right? That's not unrelated to the context that Black women find themselves in after 1865, after 1920, when the 19th Amendment has passed, right? That, is a roundabout long way of pointing to, right, there's an everyday survival practice that Black women deploy, right, today and then, that in any one moment in an organization, because of how you developed a really, significant oratory or written skill, could pop up in these exceptional ways, like we saw with Amanda Gorman as poet laureate for the inauguration for Biden. But we forget, right, Elizabeth Alexander, Black woman poet for Barack Obama's 2008 inauguration, Maya Angelou, Black woman poet for Bill Clinton's inauguration in 93. What is it then about Black women and their poetics as labor that become the foundation for all these different presidential symbolic kind of like proclamations, right? But I think are rooted in, again, the work that Black women do that inform the kind of politics that Black women take up in the exceptional and in the everyday, right? And I think that is a tension that is in the text, right? That we see this kind of, exceptional discussion about Black women as the vanguard, right? And the everyday realities that Black women are confronted with. I've been speaking for a minute and want to get other folk in. Kaylyn, looks like you're ready.
Yeah, Matt, did you have something? Your mic was off too.
So you were talking there, and it just, the first thing that came to my mind was, as you were talking about being able to be both caretakers, navigators, everything. Like it just pulled up in my head the idea of double consciousness, and the way that double consciousness both gives you sort of like, I mean, it's not a great thing that you have to have double consciousness, but at the same time, it gives you the tools to navigate the system, right? Like it tells you the landscape. And so when you're like trying to figure out, and like as soon as you were talking, I was thinking like when you're trying to figure out where do we go, being able to see the landscape, you got to be able to see the landscape to know where to go.
For our listening audience, what is a double consciousness? And, how might I push you in your description of double consciousness to consider, what gender is if Du Bois, who's somebody who has long kind of history and commitment to Black struggle from, I think, 1868 when he was born to 1963 when he died in his 90s, right? A kind of problematic relationship to Black women and gender politics, but clear kind of commitment to Black liberation and a depth to that kind of, philosophical kind of thinking, but it's also a political thinking. If double consciousness is really about, nationality and race, how does gender play into that kind of context, right? But briefly, double consciousness is W.B. Du Bois's kind of, concept of what it means to be both Black and an American that he writes about in his 1903 Souls of Black Folk, which is an interdisciplinary kind of text that's both history, kind of lyric, rhyme, literature, really beautiful piece, but relevant here. Matt, other folk?
Sorry, I didn't realize that was you were actually asking me to explain it a little bit. I thought that was rhetorical, so I apologize.
I'm not the only professor here, right? You got a professor of education, but
Kaylyn?
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to Jimmy's comment about like where do these skills come from? So something that I found really interested, and I've thought a lot about it, and I may be making it a bigger deal than it was, but like we always have the concept of church versus state, but like in the first half of the book, like pre-1900, it was church and state for a lot of these Black women. And I was trying to think, well, why? And then I was like, well, Black space would have been in church. Like, and we're still very separated in a lot of churches now. There are primarily white churches and primarily Black churches from my experiences. And so post 1900, then we started creating, or Black women, Black individuals started creating their own organizations that they could go and have a new safe space to discuss it. But it was very interesting because somewhere in there, and I was trying to find it a second ago, the comment was made podium versus pulpit. So even though it was church and state in the beginning, and then you kind of see that separation start to happen, then the whole argument of, well, women can do this, but can they be preachers? And so there was that still just like that debate through the whole thing, church versus state. But I think it really registered when Jimmy asked, like, well, why are they such good orders? Well, the safe space was in church. So now it kind of makes sense to me. Well, no wonder why state would be involved in church, or politics would be involved if that's the only space they had to discuss certain issues. And I guess I was curious, for me, is that still somewhat relevant? Do political conversations still happen in certain spaces where maybe, you wouldn't necessarily think they would, but if that's, again, one of the few safe spaces to have those discussions for certain people. So I thought that was just a really interesting kind of, juxtaposition when normally it's church, they should be separate, so say, but they're very intertwined in this book.
So I want to jump in and respond to Kaylyn just with a sort of personal anecdote for everybody. Right. So I'm a white guy who was raised Methodist and went to a Methodist church. And My partner is a Black female, and one of the great things about sort of places of worship being put online is that we can go to churches everywhere, and she grew up in a Black Baptist church. But to answer your question about like, do these spaces still exist? There is I can attest to from like last Sunday, we've started attending like virtual services at Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland. And there is still the intertwined and interconnected sort of discussion of social, political, racial issues that are intertwined with the church and the Bible that I never once heard a day in my life going to a Methodist church. And it was really interesting because I was not necessarily a spiritual person. I wouldn't have called myself a religious person. But I definitely made a different connection going to a different church and hearing a different pastor talk in a different way and connect it to things that I'm passionate about and see in the world. And so I just wanted to throw that out there from like, just share a personal experience with everybody in the room about sort of like it has been sort of eye-opening to something that, you know, my upbringing, it was completely devoid of any of that.
I just want to chime in as a Black woman raised Methodist, seeing me specifically, United Methodist Light, politics was always there. And when I say politics, I'm not talking about party politics. I'm talking about community politics. And that's what you're seeing, especially if you're going to a Baptist church out of Oakland, I'm just saying. Community politics is different than party politics, but it's absolutely, and it had to be intertwined within Black churches and Black communities. Because again, as you said, Kaylyn, it was a safe space. And it's still a safe space for a lot, but there's other safe spaces, safe Black political spaces that are coming up as a shift in a lot of younger Black people are happening as they're reevaluating numerous things in their lives. But yeah, no, absolutely. I don't remember a single sermon that wasn't actually about Black survival in one way or another in any church I've gone to my whole life.
But that goes back to what I think you said last week. I think you said it, Shaylin, was it's never been about Black, it's never been about party for the Black population. It's what group is going to have me in mind when they're making, so it's definitely a social issue. It's not about Democratic versus this versus that. It's at this point, who has my best interests at heart, right? I think that was you who said it last week. So that kind of is kind of what you're talking about, I think, too. So that's very interesting for me because I'm like, Matt, I grew up, Catholic church. I went to my basketball, the girls that were on my team, we would go to and visit each other's churches. And I reached back up to them. I said, did y'all talk? And they were like, I don't know. I don't remember because I've been removed from the church now for several years for other reasons. So it was just interesting. I don't remember it happening. So the different experiences, it's just very unique because I was definitely grown up and we never talked about it. But I was raised Catholic too, so that might have something to do with it.
So, I mean, you are riffing on a really important through line in the text in terms of religion, the church, Black women, and as a site of organizing politics and dialogue, right? Going back to the work that Black women do, the domestic sphere and or space, the kitchen, the home is also a place where we would assume, well, that's not where politics happen, right? But, we find that Black women are taking politics with them wherever they go, in part because, the Black church can be a safe space. It can also be not so safe, right, for Black women. If we're talking about leadership, if we're talking about certainly today, questions of racial sexual violence, right? The church can be safe, but it can also not, right? Black liberation, Black struggle spaces can also be, right, sites where Black women are upheld and lifted and centered, in other ways, erased and decented. That's part of the kind of point that Davis is making in the 1970s, right? It's, where, and even in spaces that are Black women led and run, like the National Association for Colored Women that Mary Church Terrell helped found in the late 19th century. Who among the diversity of Black women are included in this, movement that's meant to uplift all Black women, but certainly given the strategies that are taken at different times, all Black women are part of that project. Other folk in terms of the church, religion, Black women.
Well, in terms of the get out the vote strategy, I don't think that there's any question that in the, again, in the last 20, 30 years that the, African-American church has been a central focus for politicians to galvanize or to, work to get a vote out. If you don't have, Baptist ministers on your side as a Democratic candidate, you've got some problems. If you want to reach, large numbers of individuals, again, it's the, the Black churches that many white politicians find as their only conduit, to communicate. So I think that, that has been a source of get out the vote, the GOTV strategy that folks have used for a long time. With the, I've been out of the loop for the last, say, 10 years in terms of the political consulting side of things. And with social media, I'm not sure if that has impacted or affected the personal, visits that it was requisite for, a white politician, a sheriff's candidate, a local candidate in particular, to visit the Black churches and would try to hit 3 or 4 of them, each Sunday. So again, I just making the point that I think that the Black church has continued to play a very political role in this voting conversation, whether it be the rights to vote or whether it be to actually generate vote. It has occurred.
It's that connection to the church that, for me, strikes the current bill efforts nationally to curb the efforts on Sunday, early voting and group voting and taking people. I had never thought about that because I'm also someone who politics and church and religion didn't tie together. So it hadn't occurred to me that that was such an important aspect of a political community. Of no matter how you vote, it's probably not about who or what you're going to vote for, but just the activity tied to church of getting out there on that day, that it's all part of the history. And it's very harmful what we're looking at now and trying to curb that, but I don't think it's understood by a lot how important that is to the Black community.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that in terms of creating safe spaces, Black people, especially Black women, have created their own kind of spaces out of pretty much anything and everything. And I read a really great book last spring for Dr. Foster's class called Beauty Shop Politics by Tiffany Gill, where people wouldn't necessarily think that a beauty salon would be a political place, but it was actually a very important spot for Black women who wouldn't necessarily be getting that information anywhere else, especially if they were working in the homes of other white people. And even in the book, she talks about how Hillary Clinton went into a Black beauty salon, and Obama had gone into barbershops to talk to people, make themselves seem every day so they could gather up votes. And there are like many, many different aspects of safe spaces that Black people and Black women in particular have created for themselves. And just talking about the importance of community in terms of voting. A lot of older Black people don't drive, they can't drive, they never drove. So they rely on other people in the community to get them where they need to go, which ties back to my fascination with the federal government and their states' rights approach, as we have seen that the states are not going to act right if it's left up to them, most likely. So like there needs to be some type of understanding from those folks in power in Washington, but I don't know how to make that clear to them that that like these things, it's still part of what Martha Jones is talking about. Like it doesn't, I don't think it ends with Stacey Abrams. It's just like it didn't begin with Stacey Abrams. It's going to keep going because it might just be the Afro pessimist in me, but like we will always have these issues.
You said a lot of beautiful things there, Tranquilla. I really appreciate you bringing in Tiffany Gill and her work in Beauty Shop Politics, and the point that Black women, have continued to carve out spaces for politics in ways that, again, to the outside world, if you weren't a part of this space, and especially a lot of these salons were in Black women's homes, right? So you're inviting a Black woman to your home for this thing that is seemingly apolitical, but it's actually rooted in politics. We might also consider what the white church and or religion has always been to the maintenance of voting access, but also voting suppression in this country and in the U.S. South and in Louisiana as well. Is it not white churches where, white citizens councils and other organizations, Klan, right, coordinated their own politics of voting repression, right? So I think there's a deeper kind of question of what religion and institutions that emerge from it have been since this country's founding, that at some point, and it wasn't in the country's founding, the perception or demand for them to be apolitical, emerged. But for Black people, it becomes a hyper-visible site of politics. But I think, and it's not a U.S. context either, right? There are certain protections around religion that, the U.S. upholds as a special ideal. But when we think of the Black church, again, it's a complicated site. We think about the 16th Street Baptist bombing in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, right? The church was a site of organizing. That's why it was bombed in 63. If we think about Dylann Roof in, I think, 2014, and the 9 Black people who were killed in Charleston, South Carolina, right? White America has been known that the church is a site of organizing, right? I don't think it's new. And to that point, there's an excellent documentary on PBS that just came out like 2 or 3 weeks ago, February 8th, called The Black Church, This Is Our Story, This Is Our Song. Full of really a bunch of excellent Black religious studies scholars who really give, I think, this conversation added texture and depth. But Martha Jones' book is full of Black church women for a reason. One thing Tranquilla also brought up was the question of mobility and travel, right? That I think is also central to this question about Black women. Martha Jones writes on page 142 in the chapter, Make Us a Power, church activism demanded that women be armed with ideas and with stiff backs. It also demanded that they spend time on the road. Church conferences, local, regional, and national, were sprinkled throughout the year and across the nation's landscape. Meeting minutes did not reflect the many hours and multiple conveyances it took to get to the next city or a far-flung hamlet. So Black women's efforts at just moving are sort of muted in the archive, but central to, in many ways, the vulnerability they were exposed to. Conference deliberations generated the collective will that was essential to the Methodist model of governance and could only be enhanced, but never replaced by newspaper columns or pamphlets. Nothing was riskier for Black churchwomen than those hours in carriages, on the rails, and aboard the streetcars. Whether traveling in the company of men, oftentimes their minister, husbands, or alone, Black women faced a cruel and dangerous set of arrangements. More than any other travelers, they risked the indignity and danger of cars designed for men or the prospect of ejection from the ladies' cars set aside for women travelers and their companions. It's not lost upon me also that, right, the Montgomery bus boycott was a lot of Black women organizing how to get Black women from place to place and not using the bus for over a year. That's Black women's politics that's talked about later in the text, right, in terms of Rosa Parks. But this theme of mobility and how it intertwines with the Black church, I think, is a really powerful one to draw out. So it's 7:40. I think we have, another 20 minutes left in the conversation. What are some other burning kind of questions or context folks want to bring in?
Before we I was thinking about something as you were talking about the difference between politics in white churches versus politics in Black churches. I think to understand why it feels like politics are not discussed in white churches is because the politics that are discussed in white churches are kind of intertwined in societal norms and goodness versus bad. So we're looking at the way white churches talked about slavery, white churches talked about desegregation or denouncing desegregation in the way they uplifted sometimes a lot of pseudosciences that were used to legalize the oppression of people of color, not just Black folks. And even to this day, when you're looking at the way, or even the silence on things about human rights and the way that is discussed, on the way churches talk about women, it's always intertwined with this concept of holiness and righteousness to hide something a little bit more sinister. It's not only white churches didn't do that, but that's vastly different when you're looking at a Black church that's talking about, this is why we need to vote. This is why we need to fight for our schools. This is why we need to fight. This is why you don't need to take the bus. They're doing the exact same things. It's just for one group, it's of a much bigger importance than it is for another group because there's all these other layered issues. And by upholding some of these societal ills, makes some of those other issues feel a little bit more palatable. But it was actually absolutely there. It just wasn't in your face, quote unquote, like it is in Black churches.
I'll add on to Shay what you're saying there. So when I taught social studies methods, elementary social studies methods last semester, did an activity and it was around identifying social issues and then identifying what justice-oriented solutions would look like, and then identifying what charity-oriented solutions look like. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you said that, it made me think of white churches being oriented around charity-oriented solutions, which don't upend the system. They don't require any wide-scale change. They allow the problem to still exist, mm-hmm. But it saves that sort of like good person, and right, like the white supremacy allows sort of things to stay the same because I did the good deed in helping something. And so that's the first thing that came to my mind was I related back to that class, and I was like, oh yeah, like justice-oriented solutions, which say you don't need charity, let's change the system, versus like, how can you just help people but without changing the system?
Also, looking at the way those charity-oriented solutions absolutely upheld racial stereotypes about people in the ghetto or people in third world countries, and the laziness and all these unwed mothers you have to give these blankets towards. Like, that is still upholding these issues without upending and looking at why is this thing happening and what can we actually do to make this a more equitable world for everybody, whereas Black churches were looking at how do we make this a more equitable world for our community.
Which goes into all those savior narratives.
Mm-hmm.
Like Black women saved America when Doug Jones was elected in Alabama, or mm-hmm. Black women saved America when they turned out vis-a-vis Stacey Abrams and so many other Black women organizers who often go unnamed in the election of these two Democrat senators in Georgia. That narrative has a history, and it is, more beautiful in certain ways, more terrible. Sorry, Jimmy, you were going to chime in.
No, I was just, when Shay was talking, it reminded me of a theme that I think I read a few times, and that was that the idea that the fight for Black women's rights was really fighting for dignity for all. And I thought that was a very powerful, concept that, that is really what the essence of the movement was. It wasn't just for the individual or for them as a segment of a population, but it was, for the dignity of everyone. And I think that, Shay, you kind of captured some of that with your comments.
Thank you.
Kind of adding on to, not really about Black women, someone had mentioned that film, Judas and the Black Messiah, which is a great film. People should see it. And interestingly, like a lot of people were afraid of like the Black Panther Party because they saw him as like a Black nationalist. But in reality, and we saw that with the Rainbow Coalition thing, they were a party that really wanted to improve life for Black people, but also for people in general. And it was kind of going back to what you said about being afraid of like that change or not wanting that change. And that's kind of what drove to more like violence and stuff. So I think that's kind of an interesting attitude. It's like the misperception of some of these Black groups. I feel like kind of leads to this kind of thing.
The intentional misrepresentation, not misperception. The intentional of these Black groups.
They misperceive, and then that leads to the intentional. Well, I mean, yeah, you know what I mean. Back then, it was definitely intentional, but even today, it's maybe today it is still, perhaps it is still intentional today, but they're still being perceived.
They're still talked about as Chris.
Yeah, they are.
So picking up with what Jimmy said about what Shay said about the ways in which Black women had to, in many ways, advocate and insist on equality for all because of the mute and kind of deafness upon which their demands for humanity were met in movements that advocated for racial equality and mostly centered Black men, and movements that advocated for women's equality and mostly centered white women, right? So I don't think it's a coincidence that this more universal claim is made, but I think that also might misrepresent the kind of constraints that Black women were under, that is the only way they were going to be heard if they said this is for everyone, right? We see this also in the Combahee River Collective statement in the 1970s that said, when Black women are free, everyone will be free, right? And that's a common refrain that we hear, but I think speaks to a way in which Black women's experience is misunderstood. Septima Clark, Ella Baker are two Black women who don't find their way central into the Martha Jones text that really informed my teaching of the civil rights movement, in part because of the ways that they sought to enrich American democracy, right, through their contribution to, in Septima Clark's case in the 1940s and 50s, these citizenship schools that were principally about teaching Black folk how to read. Literacy was quite centrally a fundamental kind of tool in American democracy that she really, championed, that then Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, took up her kind of not just natural, but the kind of politics of Black women for Septima Clark was, how are we gonna get people to vote? Let's start with teaching them how to read the voter registration kind of card. And for Ella Baker, right, she was so central in so much of the organizing in the 1960s that we don't really think about, her arguments about the struggle and about democracy were really rooted in Black women's experiences and demand for humanity. But those are some of the kind of constraints that Black women found themselves in, right? Not just during slavery, but that we see repeating to this day that result in this everyday experience that catapults into exceptional status, right?
I think that's a good segue into Kaylyn's earlier question about the role of schools and education and activism, which was also Victoria's question. Education is activism, especially when we're talking about the education of Black people. Like, it is absolutely a form of activism. So it would make sense that teachers, educators themselves played such a huge role as activists and in multiple movements over time. Literacy schools are a great example, especially with understanding of Southern history, the fact that for many people, education past sixth grade, if you got that far, was very difficult to even obtain. So having the community or having educators go out of their way to help you learn a practical skill, not reading for the sake of reading. That's not what they were doing. They're reading to be able to make educated decisions on their lives and on the lives of their children and grandchildren and their progeny for generations to come. That's what school systems should be doing, teaching you these useful skills. I'm not talking about life skills that everyone fusses about, like, why can't people sew buttons? I don't really care about that. But just understanding how to comprehend the things happening around you and the way it affects you. That's what schools were. That's what Black schools were. The teachers were actively engaging in protest by simply being present, by going out of their way to get textbooks and to memorize entire textbooks because their kids couldn't have them. That's activism across the board. And that was a huge thing in the South.
So to tie back into, I think, Vicky's point about the contemporary context, well, if we're talking about literacy and literacy about Black history, what is the removal from the terms of discussion in these books? In this longer kind of work of Black women as educators, right? The church was a key site of education. I know my oldest aunts and uncles, right, up till sixth grade were taught in a church, right, in a small local, dirt road kind of community in central Alabama. Education is so key for those reasons. Right? We got about 9 minutes left. Other remaining kind of, thoughts about this conversation to sort of close out about Black women and the history of voting rights. Right, I think there's so much in the book that we wouldn't be able to cover in an hour and a half anyway. That I think we've covered a lot thus far. But thoughts for other people.
I was going to thank you for your mention of women who were not listed by the author and their impact to the personal note side of things. I was very pleased that you brought up Angela Davis. When I was talking about orators and so on, she was in my mind. She spoke, back in the day at my college campus. And was not only articulate, but she was forceful and she was demanding and she was exceptional. And so I again appreciate you having brought her up as well as others. So thank you for the job you're doing facilitating.
I will say that, well, nope, Tranquilla, you speak. I've spoken too much, please.
No, I was just going to say that, also oratory schools were a thing. Black people would send their children to school to learn how to give speeches and do those things because they thought, being able to give a great speech was a virtue, and not everybody could do it. And it's been a long week, but I think somebody said earlier that, somebody asked that, where are, the women who don't exist in the archives in the same way as these women do? They exist in literature, not exact people, but their stories, especially Black women authors of the time period,
Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison.
Yeah, but even before that, Frances Watkins Harper that Jones talks about, and Pauline Hopkins, and these women were writing fiction, but they were writing about what they were seeing going on around them in the 1890s and 1880s. So that's my take on why we should include more interdisciplinary approaches to traditional courses as well, because the archives can only do so much, especially for certain people who have existed outside of whiteness. And it's important that those stories get told too. And there was something else, but I forgot. So I'll tell Dr. Foster tomorrow.
No, that's beautiful. It brings us back to how we started the conversation with poetry, right? And really trying to think through how we can use and think about that poetry as a lens to reading Black history, a lens to reading American history, right? A lens to reading voting rights history. Shay, you were going to speak. I want to get some more voices in before I wrap up.
Oh, I was just going to use that Tranquilla's comment as a segue to point out the work of Ernest J. Gaines and how his work functions in that exact capacity, and invite anyone and everyone who is interested in learning more about Gaines or just discussing his work and your interpretations of it to please contact me at shaylin.woods@louisiana.edu or stop by the Ernest J. Gaines Center, because we always love friends.
Dr. Gaines is an extraordinary human being. I feel very blessed to have had the opportunity to interact with him. And as Tranquilla was talking, I was thinking of the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman in terms of, characters who emulate, in this instance, a fictional character, but certainly the aspects of life that many of us will never understand or know from a personal basis. To have been able to experience, at least through his words, were extraordinary.
Since we're centering, thank you, Matt. I agree about Dr. Gaines so much. I'm really glad that our library has a whole center dedicated to Ernest J. Gaines. And in many ways, as a Black Studies scholar, I really see this literary figure that really is central to articulating Southwestern Louisiana Black life is celebrated at our university. And Shay, as the director and archivist, I think is doing a great job to activate that legacy. The Louisiana Historical Association gave Best Book of the Year prize to a Black woman historian in Jessica Marie Johnson, who is a member of the Association of Black Women Historians that Martha Jones talks about in her acknowledgments, right? And this book that was released last year in August is titled Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World. Really powerful text. I strongly encourage you, if you are further interested in deepening your knowledge of Black women's history, you check out that text. In the acknowledgments, Jones writes about her favorite Black woman in history that she was reluctant to share often, but for her, it is Ida B. Wells, right, who does take up a pretty prominent role in her text. So I wanted to center Ida B. Wells a bit as we conclude, but also a Black woman I, again, already brought up once, who am I thinking about, the question around voting rights and kind of the traditions and legacy, right, that we see in Martha Jones' text. Again, from 1808 to today, we see a kind of practice of Black women's politics at play. And again, Ella Baker is so central to so much of civil rights history, but she organized Black history programs in the 1920s and was organizing against South African apartheid in the 1970s. And she was asked, this is a quote from a Charles Payne article, he's a civil rights historian and sociologist. She was asked how she kept it going so long. And she answered them in terms that reflected one enduring vision of the civil rights movement, which I would argue is one enduring vision of Black women's politics. And this is a quote from Ella Baker that I think gets to this question of universal kind of equality as articulation of Black women's particular politics. But if people begin to place their values in terms of how high they get in the political world, or how much worldly goods they accumulate, or what kind of cars they have, or how much money, or how much they have in the bank, that's where I begin to lose respect. To me, I'm a part of the human family. What the human family will accomplish, I can't control. But it isn't impossible that what those who came along with me went through might stimulate others to continue to fight for a society that does not have those kinds of problems. Somewhere down the line, the numbers increase, the tribe increases. So how do you keep on? I can't help it. I don't claim to have any corner on an answer, but I believe the struggle is eternal. Somebody else carries on, right? So I see the kind of ethos and spirit of Jones's book really speaking to that, Ella Baker quote, right? About the kind of struggle and position that Black women find themselves in, but the kind of innovativeness and genius that transforms organizations, that transforms the U.S. over and over and over again, right? And we'll see, as her book alludes to, Stacey Abrams and others, what that dynamic looks like in 2021 and moving forward, right? I think we need to turn to these histories to learn more about the future, right? Not just about the past. We're at 8 o'clock.
We're at 8 o'clock, guys. As always, this was fun. And before we all log off, I'm going to add the survey in the chat box. Please, please, please do fill out this survey. It is important information that the funding agents and LEH need to evaluate how well these programs are going over, and hopefully they'll be able to fund more of these kind of events. This has been great. This is not a terrible way to spend a Wednesday night. I'm so glad each and every one of you decided to participate, and I look forward to next Wednesday. If you're watching and you signed up, we will be starting next Wednesday at 6:30. If not, and you didn't sign up and you're enjoying the YouTube content, please come back and join us again next week. Thank you, guys. Have a safe night. Have a wonderful evening, and have a great day tomorrow. Goodbye. See you.
Take care. Thank you.
I was waiting for AOC, but I guess. Okay.